The rain never truly fell in Sector Gamma 7. It was an illusion, a soft, percussive whisper of recycled water against the permaglass dome of the Enclave, a constant metronomic reminder of the world that was no longer theirs. Elian listened to it from his archival station, the sound a dull ache behind his temples. It was a sound of mourning for a sky he'd only seen in degraded data files. Here, everything was controlled. The temperature, the light, the very air he breathed, scrubbed clean of pollens and passions and anything that might disrupt the precise, sterile order of things. He was an archivist of a dead world, a curator of ghosts, and the quiet suited him. It had always suited him. He was a beta, stable, unremarkable, a perfect, functional cog in the great humming machine of the Enclave. His designation was a comfort, a shield. Betas were the bedrock of their society, the calm sea upon which the volatile ships of alphas and omegas sailed their dramatic, biologically determined courses. Elian cataloged their histories, the fevers, the bonds, the tragedies with a detached empathy. He read of heats that burned like dying suns, of ruts that could shatter resolve, of scents that drove men to poetry and to ruin. He filed them away under alpha-numeric codes, the grand, messy epics of instinct reduced to sterile data points. His own scent was a quiet, unassuming thing, like old paper and dried herbs, barely noticeable. His heart beat at a steady 68 beats per minute. His hormonal levels were a flat, placid line on every quarterly bioscan. He was safe. Reese, his partner of 3 years, was also a beta. Their life together was a testament to that safety. It was a life of quiet evenings, shared meals in their minimalist living unit, and the soft, uncomplicated pressure of a hand held in the sterile glow of the city lights filtering through their window. Their love was a carefully constructed thing, built of compatible schedules and mutual respect, not the chaotic pheromonal fire he read about in the archives. It was a sensible love, a manageable love, and Elian was grateful for it. He truly was. He would trace the placid lines of Reese's face as he slept, the gentle rise and fall of his chest, and feel a sense of profound, if muted, contentment. This was his life, the life he had chosen, the life he had been given. But lately a strange restlessness had taken root in his bones, a low hum of dissonance beneath the placid surface of his existence. It started with the rain. He found himself mesmerized by the way the synthetic droplets traced liquid silver paths down the dome, a yearning for something real, something untamed, tightening his chest. He would touch the cool surface of the archive's observation window and imagine the feel of actual cold water on his skin, the scent of wet earth rising from a world he would never know. The feeling was illogical, a flaw in his programming, and he would push it down, burying it under layers of routine and reason. He would focus on the crisp feel of the data slates in his hands, the faint ozonic scent of the servers, the steady, predictable rhythm of his work. The first real tremor came on a Tuesday. It was a subtle shift, a warmth that bloomed low in his belly, unfamiliar and unwelcome. He dismissed it as indigestion, a reaction to the nutrient paste they'd had for their morning meal. But the warmth didn't fade. It coiled and tightened, a slow, insistent pressure that made the starched collar of his uniform feel like a chokehold. The air in the archive, usually so neutral, suddenly seemed thick, cloying. The scent of old paper he normally found comforting now felt dusty and suffocating. He could smell the faint metallic tang of the ventilation system, the synthetic floral scent of the cleaner used on the floors, the sharp antiseptic smell of the data slate cleanser on his own hands. Every scent was magnified, amplified into a screaming cacophony that made his head spin. His focus, usually so sharp, fractured into 1,000 glittering shards. The neat lines of code on the screen before him blurred into an incomprehensible script. He gripped the edge of his console, knuckles white. His heart was no longer beating at a steady 68. It was a frantic, panicked drum against his ribs. A fine sheen of sweat broke out across his brow, cold and clammy. This was not indigestion. This was not a passing illness. This was a system failure, a biological short circuit that his beta physiology should have rendered impossible. He could feel a strange, sweet scent rising from his own skin, something like honey and night-blooming jasmine, a scent he had never produced before. It was mortifying. It was terrifying. It was the scent of an Omega, the scent of everything he was not. He fumbled for the comms unit, his fingers clumsy and trembling. He needed Reese. He needed the sterile, predictable safety of their shared life to anchor him before this tide of wrongness pulled him under. But as he reached for the button, a wave of heat so intense it felt like he was being immolated from the inside out washed over him. His vision swam, the floor tilted, a low, keening sound escaped his lips, a sound of pure, animal distress that did not belong to him. It was the sound of a cage door swinging open, revealing a creature he had never known existed within himself. And as the darkness swamped his senses, the last coherent thought that pierced through the roaring in his ears was a single stark realization. The archives had lied. The data was incomplete. He was not a cog in the machine. He was a ghost, a statistical anomaly, a biological impossibility about to come terrifyingly, devastatingly alive. And the sterile, controlled world of the Enclave was the worst possible place for a creature like him to be born. The world returned to him in fragments of sensation, sharp and cruel, the coldness of the floor against his cheek, the relentless sterile hum of a medical suite's life support systems, the scent of antiseptic so sharp it burned his nasal passages and made his eyes water. But beneath it, another scent, something dark and complex and utterly overwhelming. It was the scent of ozone after a lightning strike, of old leather and sandalwood, of something ancient and powerful and utterly terrifyingly alpha. It wasn't a scent to be analyzed, it was a scent to be obeyed. It coiled around him, a physical presence in the room sinking into his pores, setting every nerve ending on fire. He was drowning in it. His body, this new traitorous body, reacted before his mind could. A deep, shuddering tremor ran through him, a primal response of submission and terror and a desperate, shameful wanting that made him feel hollowed out. He forced his eyes open. The light was a merciless, clinical white, reflecting off polished chrome and pristine white walls. He was in a containment chamber, a transparent wall separating him from a small, stark observation room. And in that room, standing perfectly still, was the source of the scent. Director Valerius, the alpha of alphas, the architect of the Enclave's rigid social order, a man whose name was spoken in hushed, reverent tones. Elian had only ever seen him in official broadcasts, a severe, handsome figure with eyes the color of a winter storm and a stillness that seemed to command the very air around him. To see him in person, to be the focus of that cold, analytical gaze, was like being pinned by an entomologist. He was a specimen, a curiosity, a problem to be solved. Valerius wore a perfectly tailored black uniform that seemed to absorb the light, making him a void in the sterile white room. He held a data slate, but his eyes were not on it. They were fixed on Elian, and there was no emotion in them. No anger, no pity, no desire, just a chilling, profound curiosity. The kind of look Elian himself might give a corrupted data file just before wiping it from the system. Subject designation, E734. Valerius's voice was a low, resonant baritone, amplified by a speaker in Elian's chamber. It was as calm and controlled as the rest of him, yet it vibrated through the floor, through Elian's very bones. Designated Beta. Age 27 standard cycles. Archivist Sector Gamma 7. Is this information correct? Elian tried to answer, but his throat was a desert. He could only manage a choked, rasping sound. The sweet, cloying scent of his own distress filled the small chamber. A desperate, pheromonal scream for help, for comfort, for an alpha. The realization was a fresh wave of horror. His body was betraying every principle he had ever lived by. He was not meant for this. He was meant for quiet evenings with Reese, for the predictable comfort of a beta's life. The data is correct, he finally managed to whisper, the words scraping his throat raw. There is a mistake, a system error. My biometrics. Your biometrics have been updated, Valerius stated, his voice devoid of inflection. He made a small gesture on the data slate, and a holographic display shimmered into existence beside him, showing Elian's own biological data. The placid, flat lines were gone. In their place were jagged peaks and deep valleys, a chaotic symphony of hormonal surges. An Omega in the full agonizing throes of their first heat. It was undeniable. It was impossible. You are what is known as a latent Omega, a recessive gene, dormant for generations, now expressed. A 1 in 10 million anomaly. You are, from a genetic standpoint, fascinating. Fascinating. The word was a scalpel, dissecting him, stripping him of his identity. He was not Elian anymore. He was E734, a subject, an anomaly. He pushed himself up, his limbs trembling with a combination of fever and fear. The thin medical gown they had put him in did nothing to ward off the chill of the room or the more profound chill of Valerius's gaze. What are you going to do with me, Va?" he asked, his voice shaking. Omegas who presented outside the sanctioned breeding programs were reintegrated, a sterile, bureaucratic term for erasure. They were a disruption to the order, a loose variable in a perfect equation. Valerius was silent for a long moment, his gray eyes sweeping over Elian, cataloging every tremor, every hitched breath, every wave of panicked pheromones rolling off him. The intensity of his focus was a physical weight, pressing down on Elian, making it hard to breathe. The alpha scent in the air thickened, a deliberate, calculated act of dominance. It was not aggressive, not a threat of violence, but a simple, irrefutable statement of power. I am in control. You are not. Elian's traitorous body responded instantly. A wave of heat so intense it made him dizzy, a desperate instinct to expose his throat, to make himself small, to appease the overwhelming presence on the other side of the glass. He fought it, digging his nails into his palms, the sharp sting of pain a small, desperate anchor in the storm of his own biology. He was Elian. He was an archivist. He was not this cowering, instinct-driven creature. The standard protocol for unsanctioned presentations is inefficient, Valerius said at last, his voice a low murmur. It treats the anomaly as a flaw to be discarded. I prefer to see it as an opportunity, a data point to be studied. He took a step closer to the transparent wall, and Elian flinched back, a purely reflexive action. The director's lips thinned in something that might have been annoyance, or perhaps just observation. Your fear is a chemical reaction. Your distress is a hormonal surge. Your desire, he let the word hang in the air, cold and sharp, is a biological imperative. It can all be measured. It can all be understood. And what can be understood can be controlled. He raised a hand and touched the smooth, cool surface of the wall that separated them, a gesture of impossible distance and terrifying intimacy. Elian could feel the faint vibration of it through the floor. He could almost imagine the heat of that hand, the strength in it. His skin prickled, a phantom touch that was both a threat and a promise. The honey jasmine scent of his heat intensified, a desperate, involuntary answer to the alpha's proximity. You are a unique opportunity, E734, Valerius continued, his voice dropping even lower, a hypnotic whisper that bypassed Elian's conscious mind and spoke directly to the terrified Omega cowering within him. The Enclave's Omega program has been stagnant, based on centuries-old data. You are new. You are a clean slate. I intend to study your presentation to map every response, every fluctuation. You will be my project. He was not a person. He was not Elian. He was a project, an experiment. The clinical detachment in the director's voice was more terrifying than any threat of violence. Elian's world, the safe, predictable world he had so carefully constructed, had not just cracked. It had been atomized. He was adrift in a terrifying new reality, his own body a prison, and the man on the other side of the glass was his warden, his scientist, his god. The heat crested again, a wave of pure agonizing need, and as he collapsed back onto the cold floor, his body slick with sweat, his mind fracturing under the strain, he looked at the impassive face of Director Valerius and understood. This wasn't just the wrong Alpha. This was the antithesis of everything he had ever known or wanted. This was an Alpha who didn't see a person, but a puzzle. And Elian was the one who was about to be taken apart, piece by excruciating piece. The days that followed blurred into a seamless tapestry of fevered sensation and cold observation. Time lost its meaning, measured not in the sterile chimes of the Enclave's chronometers, but in the brutal, rhythmic cycles of his own body. He was a storm, a biological tempest, and Valerius was the calm, unmoving eye at its center. The director was a constant presence on the other side of the transparent wall, sometimes for hours on end, his posture unchanging, his expression impassive. He would watch, his gray eyes missing nothing, as Elian writhed on the thin mattress, lost in the delirium of a heat he had never been meant to experience. He would dictate notes into his data slate, his voice a low, clinical murmur that cut through the haze of Elian's pain. Subject's core temperature has elevated by 3.7 degrees. Pheromone output has increased by 200%. Subject is exhibiting nesting behavior despite the lack of appropriate materials. The observation was a violation more profound than any physical touch. Elian felt flayed open, his most private, primal self exposed and catalogued like a rare insect. He tried to fight it, to cling to the remnants of the person he had been. He would recite archival codes, list the names of forgotten poets from the old world, anything to prove to himself that his mind was still his own. But the heat was a relentless tide, dragging him down into a world of pure instinct. His body ached with a deep, cavernous emptiness, a need so profound it felt like it would tear him in two. And the only thing that offered any relief, any focus in the swirling chaos, was the scent of the Alpha on the other side of the glass. That scent of ozone and sandalwood was an anchor and a torment. It promised a surcease to his suffering that it simultaneously denied. It was the key to a lock he hadn't known he possessed, and the man who held it was refusing to turn it. Sometimes Reese's face would float up in his memory, a pale, gentle ghost from another lifetime. He remembered the quiet comfort of Reese's hand in his, the soft, unassuming scent of him, like clean linen and warm tea. It was the scent of safety, of a life without this fire in his blood. But the memory was faint, washed out, like a photograph left too long in the sun. It held no power here. It could not compete with the overwhelming immediate reality of the Alpha who watched him. The thought of Reese brought a pang of guilt, a sharp, piercing sorrow for the life he had lost, for the man he had betrayed simply by existing in this new, monstrous form. But even that guilt was a distant thing, a flickering candle in the face of the inferno. On what he thought might be the fourth cycle, something changed. The waves of heat were becoming unbearable, pushing him to the very edge of his endurance. He was curled in on himself, trembling, a low, continuous sound of distress vibrating in his chest. He was burning up, yet he was freezing cold. He saw Valerius observing him, and a surge of desperate, helpless anger rose through the haze. "Stop it," he rasped, his voice raw. "Just stop looking at me." For the first time, Valerius did not dictate a note. He simply watched, his head tilted slightly. "Your request is illogical. My observation is necessary for the project." "I am not a project." The words were a scream torn from his throat. "I am a person. My name is Elian." A flicker of something, was it surprise, interest, crossed the director's face. It was there and gone in an instant. "Your former designation is irrelevant to the current biological reality," he said, his voice as level as ever. The entity Elian was a social construct based on incomplete data. "This," he gestured towards Elian with his data slate, "is the truth." The coldness of it, the absolute dismissal of his entire life, shattered something within him. The anger drained away, replaced by a vast, empty despair. Tears, hot and thick, streamed down his face, mingling with the sweat that slicked his skin. He was nothing, a collection of impulses, a set of data points. He sobbed, a raw, ugly sound that echoed in the sterile chamber. He was truly and utterly alone. He closed his eyes, wanting to dissolve, to cease to exist. He heard a soft hiss, the sound of a pneumatic seal disengaging. His eyes snapped open. Valerius was no longer in the observation room. He was standing in the doorway of the chamber itself. The transparent wall was gone. There was nothing between them now but a few feet of sterilized air. The director's scent, no longer filtered, washed over Elian in a suffocating, intoxicating wave. It was a physical blow. Elian scrambled backwards on the mattress, pressing himself against the cold wall, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Every instinct screamed at him. Danger. Alpha. Submit. Run. They were contradictory, impossible commands that paralyzed him. Valerius did not move closer. He simply stood there, a tall, dark silhouette against the harsh white light of the corridor behind him. He had removed the data slate. His hands were empty, held loosely at his sides. "The subject's emotional distress is producing stress hormones that could corrupt the data," he said, but his voice was different. The speaker-filtered sterility was gone. This was his real voice, a low, resonant sound that vibrated in the air. "A state of calm is required for accurate measurement." "Stay away from me," Elian whispered, the words barely audible. "That is also an illogical request," Valerius replied, taking a slow, deliberate step into the room. "Your biology is calling for proximity. Your fear is a cognitive override. The two impulses are at war. It must be exhausting." He took another step. He was closer now, close enough for Elian to see the faint silver threads at his temples, the impossibly fine texture of the black fabric of his uniform. He smelled of power, of control, of a loneliness so profound it was like the cold between stars. That last part was an instinctual read, a piece of information delivered directly to the omega part of his brain, and it confused him more than anything else. Valerius stopped just out of reach. He knelt, not in a gesture of supplication, but with the fluid, precise grace of a predator. His movements were economical, stripped of all extraneous motion. He was now on eye level with Elian, who was still pressed against the wall. The director's gray eyes, so cold and distant from behind the glass, were now filled with a startling, focused intensity. Elian could see the dark ring around the iris, the faint lines at the corners. He could feel the heat radiating from the Alpha's body. It was a furnace that promised to either consume him or grant him warmth. "Your scent," Valerius murmured, his voice so quiet it was almost a thought. "Jasmine. And something else. Honey. An unusual combination. Archaic. The genetic markers for it were thought to be extinct." He was analyzing him even now, but there was something else in his tone. A note of wonder? He slowly, deliberately, extended a hand. He did not try to touch Elian. He simply held it out, palm up, in the space between them, an offering, a test. Your system is in crisis, he said. It requires regulation, a calming pheromonal anchor. My presence will provide that. It was a clinical explanation for an act that felt anything but. Elian stared at the outstretched hand. It was a strong hand, the fingers long and elegant, the nails immaculately clean. A hand that signed orders, that controlled a city, that held the power of life and death. He could feel the silent command in the air, the sheer force of the Alpha's will telling him to comply. But he could also feel something else. A strange, quiet invitation. Trembling, driven by a force he no longer understood or controlled, Elian slowly, hesitantly, lifted his own hand. It shook so badly he could barely control it. His skin was slick with sweat, his fingers icy cold. He reached out, his fingertips hovering just inches from the director's palm. The air between them crackled with a strange energy. This was a boundary, a line being crossed. The moment his skin made contact with the Alpha's, a jolt, sharp and electric, shot up his arm. It was not painful. It was a connection, a circuit being completed. A wave of pure, undiluted alpha pheromones poured directly into his system, not through the air, but through that single point of contact. It was a targeted dose, a controlled release, and it was devastatingly effective. The roaring fire of the heat did not vanish, but it was banked. The sharp, agonizing edges of his needs softened, soothed by the calm, steady power flowing from Valerius. The frantic panic in his chest subsided, replaced by a profound, shuddering wave of relief. He let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding, a sound that was half sob, half sigh. His eyes, which had been wide with terror, fluttered shut. He sagged against the wall, his strength completely gone. His hand remained in the director's, a small, trembling thing engulfed by the Alpha's warmth and strength. Valerius did not pull away, he simply held on, his grip firm and steady. Elian could feel the slow, powerful beat of the director's pulse through his skin. It was a steady, grounding rhythm in the chaos of his own body. For the first time in days, he felt a flicker of something other than pain and fear. It was a fragile, terrifying thing. It was a spark of safety. And it was coming from the one man in the universe he should have feared the most. The wrong Alpha. The one who saw him as an experiment. And yet, his hand was so very, very warm. The transfer from the medical containment chamber to the director's private quarters was a disorienting blur. Elian was weak, his body still humming with the fever of the heat, though the sharpest edges had been smoothed away by Valerius's intervention. He was wrapped in a soft, gray blanket that smelled faintly of the Alpha, ozone, and sandalwood, and the scent was a strange, disquieting comfort. He was aware of guards in pristine white armor, their faces hidden behind impassive helmets, their movements silent and efficient. He was aware of the silent glide of a transport vehicle through hushed, sterile corridors, but his focus was entirely on the man who walked beside him, a still point in the motion. Valerius did not touch him again, but his presence was a tangible force, a shield against the curious or fearful glances of the few personnel they passed. No one dared to meet the director's eyes. They looked at Elian, this strange, blanket-wrapped anomaly, with a mixture of pity and revulsion, then quickly looked away. The director's quarters were nothing like Elian had imagined. He had expected more of the same sterile white, more chrome and glass. Instead, the space was a sanctuary of quiet, understated luxury. The walls were a deep charcoal gray, the floors a dark, polished wood that seemed to drink the light. The furniture was minimalist but made of rich, natural materials. There was a large window, not of permaglass, but of real crystalline silicate, that looked out not onto the enclosed city, but upwards at the shimmering, rain-streaked curve of the enclave's dome. It was a space designed for contemplation, for solitude. It was profoundly, achingly lonely, and it smelled everywhere of Valerius. The scent was woven into the very fabric of the place, a constant low thrum of alpha presence that made the Omega in him feel both safe and exquisitely vulnerable. "You will stay here," Valerius said, his voice quiet in the large, silent room. "The medical suite is designed for containment, not stabilization. Your hormonal levels require a regulated environment. This environment is regulated." He meant that it was saturated with his own scent. It was a territorial marking, a claim. Elian was now officially under his protection and his possession. The thought sent a tremor of both fear and a shameful, instinctual pleasure through him. He was led to a bedroom that was as Spartan and as elegant as the rest of the apartment. A low bed with a simple dark frame, covered in crisp white linens. A single abstract piece of art on the wall, a swirl of black and silver that looked like a captured galaxy. Valerius gestured to the bed. "Rest. A nutritional synthesizer is programmed with your dietary needs. The sonic shower is calibrated to your core temperature. All stimuli have been minimized." He was still the scientist, listing variables, controlling the experiment. But his gaze lingered on Elian's face for a fraction of a second too long, and his expression was unreadable. Elian sank onto the bed, the mattress yielding beneath his slight weight. The blanket was still wrapped around him, a cocoon of borrowed scent and warmth. He watched as Valerius turned to leave. "Why?" The word was a whisper, but in the profound silence of the room it was as loud as a shout. Valerius paused at the door, his back to Elian. "Why are you doing this? Not the protocol? Why here?" The director was silent for a long moment. Elian could see the rigid line of his shoulders, the perfect stillness of his posture. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, devoid of its usual clinical detachment. "The Enclave's Omega program was designed by my predecessor. It is predicated on the idea that Omegas are a resource to be managed, that their biology is a weakness to be contained and exploited. For 50 years it has produced stable but uninspired results, bonds of convenience, lineages of genetic compatibility. There is no fire." He half-turned, his face cast in shadow, only the sharp line of his jaw visible in the dim light. "Your presentation is not stable. It is not convenient. It is chaotic. It is powerful. It is a throwback to an earlier, more volatile iteration of our species, the kind of biology that inspired the poetry you archive." Elian stared at him, stunned into silence. He had assumed the director's interest was purely scientific, a desire to dissect and understand a new phenomenon. But this was something else. This was philosophical, an ideological curiosity. "And you want to study it," Elian said, the words a statement, not a question. "I want to understand it," Valerius corrected softly. "I want to see what happens when an anomaly of your magnitude is not suppressed, but observed, allowed to reach its full expression in a controlled environment." He turned to face Elian fully. The shadows played across his face, making his expression difficult to decipher. "I told you that your fear is a cognitive override. Perhaps my control is a similar mechanism, a lifetime of conditioning. You are a disruption, E734, a disruption to my systems as much as to your own." He used the designation, but it sounded different now, not a label, but a name known only to him. "Rest. We will continue the observation when you have stabilized." The door slid shut behind him, leaving Elian alone in the vast, silent room, his mind reeling. He was an experiment, yes, but the experiment was not just on him. It was on Valerius, too. He was a variable introduced into the director's own perfect equation. This wasn't just about controlling him, it was about Valerius testing the limits of his own control. The realization was terrifying, but it was also the first glimmer of agency Elian had felt since the heat began. He was not just a passive subject, he was an active catalyst, a force of change. He looked around the room at the sterile luxury, the profound loneliness of it all. He could smell Valerius everywhere, but he could also smell something else, a faint ghost of a scent clinging to the edges of the powerful alpha pheromones. It was a floral scent, something delicate and sweet, but faded, like pressed flowers in an old book, a scent of loss, a scent of memory. It was the scent of an Omega who had been here before. The thought was a jolt of ice in his veins. He was not the first. This quiet, controlled sanctuary had been a cage for someone else. He thought of the director's words. The Omega program has been stagnant. Had Valerius tried this before? Had another anomaly been brought here to this lonely room to be studied? What had happened to them? He slid off the bed, his legs still unsteady, and walked to the single window. He looked up at the artificial rain streaking down the dome, the city lights of the enclave, a cold, glittering constellation below. He was in the heart of the system, in the private sanctum of the man who ran it all. He was closer to the center of power than anyone, yet he had never been more of a prisoner. He pressed his hand to the cool glass just as he had done in the archive a lifetime ago. But he was no longer mourning a world he couldn't have. He was now trapped in a world he couldn't understand, with an alpha whose motives were a labyrinth of cold logic and hidden pain. And he had a sickening feeling that to survive, he would have to find his way to the center of that maze, to the ghost that haunted this beautiful empty cage. The days settled into a strange, surreal rhythm. The violent peaks of the heat subsided, leaving behind a constant, low-grade fever and a deep, humming awareness of the alpha who was his keeper. Valerius was meticulous in his care and his observation. He brought Elian nutrient packs himself, his presence filling the doorway for a few brief, charged moments before he would retreat again. He never stayed long, never initiated conversation beyond a clinical inquiry about Elian's physical state. Core temperature is stable. Any phantom sensations, auditory or olfactory hallucinations? He would ask, his eyes scanning Elian with that same unnerving analytical focus. Elian would answer in monosyllables, his voice still rough. He was a patient reporting his symptoms to a doctor, a lab rat describing the effects of a new drug. But between these brief formal interactions, a silent conversation was taking place. It was a conversation spoken in the language of scent, of presence, of shared space. Elian's own scent, the honey and jasmine, was no longer a frantic scream of distress. It had softened, ripened, filling the apartment with a sweet, languid perfume. It was a scent of burgeoning Omega life, and it mingled with Valerius's ever-present ozone and sandalwood, creating a unique aromatic signature in the apartment. It was the scent of a nascent pack, a pack of two. The idea was so absurd, so dangerous, that Elian tried to push it away, but the truth of it resonated deep in his bones. His instincts, now fully awakened, recognized Valerius not as a captor, but as his alpha. The one whose scent meant safety, whose presence calmed the storm in his blood. His mind, the archivist's mind that clung to logic and reason, rebelled against it. This man was his jailer. This man had stripped him of his name, his life, his identity. But his body, this new traitorous body, did not care about logic. It only cared about the steady, grounding presence of the alpha. The ghost of the other Omega was a constant, subtle presence. Elian would catch the faint, faded floral scent in the folds of a curtain, in the back of a closet, in the pages of a book left on a shelf. It was a whisper of a life that had been lived here and then extinguished. He started to look for other signs. In the library, a vast two-story room filled with physical books, an unheard-of luxury, he found a volume of old-world poetry. The pages were worn, the corners soft. Tucked inside was a pressed flower, a star-shaped white bloom, now brittle and faded. It was a jasmine blossom, the same scent as his own. The blood drained from his face. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a pattern. He began to feel a strange connection to this ghost, this predecessor. He imagined them sitting in this same library, reading this same book, their scent filling the lonely apartment, just as his did now. He felt a kinship with their fear, their confusion, their hope, and he was terrified that he was doomed to repeat their fate. One evening, emboldened by a strange surge of courage, he decided to confront the silence. Valerius was in his study, a pool of light in the darkened apartment, reviewing reports on a large holographic screen. Elian stood in the doorway, a silent observer, until the director seemed to sense his presence and turned, his gray eyes questioning. "There was someone else to," Elian said, his voice quiet but clear. "Another Omega. Here." He didn't phrase it as a question. Valerius's face, usually so impassive, tightened almost imperceptibly. The air in the room grew heavy, the alpha scent sharpening with a defensive edge. "The experiment requires focus on the current subject," he stated, his voice cold, dismissing the inquiry. "Was their scent like mine?" Elian pressed, taking a step into the study. He held up the book of poetry, the pressed jasmine flower visible between the pages. "Did they read these poems? Did you watch them and measure them and call them a project too?" The words were sharper than he intended, laced with an accusation that was born of fear. He was afraid for the ghost, and he was afraid for himself. Valerius stared at the book in Elian's hand, and for a single, unguarded moment, a look of profound, devastating grief crossed his face. It was so raw, so naked, that it stole Elian's breath. The calm, controlled director was gone, and in his place was a man haunted. The look vanished as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the familiar mask of cold authority. But the mask was cracked. Elian had seen behind it. His name was Lyron, Valerius said, his voice a low, rough whisper. The use of a name, a real name, was a shocking admission. He was my younger brother. The confession hung in the air between them, heavy and suffocating. Elian felt the floor drop out from under him. A brother, not a test subject, not an anomaly. Family. What happened to him?" Elian whispered, his own anger forgotten, replaced by a sudden aching empathy for the man in front of him. "He was like you," Valerius said, turning away to look at the star-strewn view of the dome. "A latent Omega. He presented late, at 20. Our family has a strong alpha lineage. His presentation was seen as a genetic failure, a source of shame." His voice was flat, reciting a history he had clearly gone over in his mind 1,000 times. "I was already a junior administrator in the Enclave. I used my influence to shield him. I brought him here. I thought I could protect him. I thought I could fix him." That was the word that struck Elian. Fix. Not understand. Not accept. Fix. "I treated him like a problem to be solved," Valerius continued, his voice laced with a self-loathing so cold it was like frozen iron. "I monitored his heat, I regulated his diet, I tried to suppress his instincts with hormonal dampeners. I was trying to turn him back into a beta, to make him acceptable, safe." He clenched his fists at his sides. "But his biology was stronger than my science. He fell into a depressive state. The suppression protocols, they broke his spirit. He felt like a freak, a failure. He told me this place, which I saw as a sanctuary, felt like the most beautiful prison in the world. And one day, while I was in a council meeting arguing for more humane research protocols, he found a way to override the atmospheric controls on the balcony. He stepped out into the raw, unfiltered air of the underlevels. Valerius fell silent. He didn't need to finish the story. The unfiltered air was toxic, a death sentence. Elian felt a profound, vicarious grief. For Lyron, the boy who bloomed into something his world couldn't accept, and for Valerius, the brother who, in his attempt to protect, had built the cage that killed him. "You're not trying to fix me," Elian said, the realization dawning on him. "You're not suppressing me. You're doing the opposite. You're letting it happen." "I will not make the same mistake twice," Valerius stated, his voice rough with emotion. He turned back to face Elian, and the look in his eyes was no longer that of a scientist observing a specimen. It was the look of a man facing his own ghost. "I failed him because I was afraid of what he was. I let the Enclave's doctrine of control poison my own judgment. I saw his nature as a flaw. I will not do that with you." He took a step closer, his gaze intense. "When I look at you, I see a second chance, a chance to do it right, to observe, to understand, not to control, to see the potential, not the pathology." He was rerunning his failed experiment, and Elian was the new variable. He was a stand-in for a dead brother. The thought should have been horrifying, a new kind of violation. But strangely, it wasn't. It was human. It cracked open the cold, calculating director and revealed the grieving, guilt-ridden man beneath. It made him vulnerable. It made him real. I'm not him," Elian said softly, but with a firm, quiet strength he hadn't known he possessed. "My name is Elian. I am not your second-chance director. I am my own person." Valerius looked at him, and a slow, sad smile touched his lips. It was the first time Elian had ever seen him smile, and it transformed his severe features into something achingly handsome. "I know," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "That is the variable I did not anticipate." The space between them hummed with a new kind of tension. It was no longer the tension of captor and captive, of Alpha and Omega. It was the tension of two broken people, bound together by a ghost, standing on the precipice of something terrifying and unknown. The experiment had just become infinitely more complicated and infinitely more dangerous for them both. The revelation of Lyron's story shattered the sterile framework of their arrangement. The invisible wall between observer and subject dissolved, leaving behind something far more complex and fragile. Valerius no longer confined himself to his study. He would join Elian in the main living area, sitting in a chair across the room, not with a data slate, but with a physical book. The silence between them thick with unspoken thoughts. The dynamic had shifted from clinical observation to a quiet shared vigil. They were two solitary creatures circling each other in a gilded cage, bound by a history that wasn't even entirely their own. Elian found himself watching the director, not with fear, but with a new searching curiosity. He saw the way Valerius's brow would furrow slightly when he read something that disturbed him, the way he would rub his thumb over the back of his own hand, a small unconscious gesture of self-soothing. He noticed the exhaustion that clung to him like a shroud, the faint, dark circles under his eyes that even the Enclave's advanced cosmetic enhancers couldn't entirely conceal. This was the man who held the entire city in his cold, logical grip, yet he couldn't outrun the ghost of his own brother. The paradox was fascinating. It made the powerful Alpha seem breakable. A strange, tentative bond began to form in the quiet spaces of their shared confinement. It wasn't spoken, it was felt. Sometimes Elian would be struck by a wave of intense melancholy, a profound sense of loss that wasn't his own, and he would look up to see Valerius staring out at the dome, his expression lost and distant. At other times, a flicker of Elian's own anxiety. A spike of fear about his uncertain future would cause Valerius to look up from his work, his gray eyes finding Elian's across the room, a silent question in their depths. It was a nascent empathic link, a side effect of the prolonged proximity between a new Omega and a powerful Alpha. A bond was forming, not by choice or ceremony, but by the slow, inevitable intertwining of their very beings. It was terrifying. It felt like destiny. One evening, Elian was in the library tracing the spines of the ancient books, the scent of old paper a small comfort from his former life. He found a collection of star charts from the old world, maps of constellations that were no longer visible through the Enclave's polluted atmosphere. He was tracing the shape of Orion with his fingertip when Valerius entered the room. The archives in Sector Gamma 7 contain a digital copy of that text, the director said, his voice startling Elian. Its degradation level is 43%. The physical copy is, of course, superior. I preferred the digital copies, Elian admitted, not looking up from the page. They were cleaner, less emotional. And now, Bun? Valerius asked, his voice closer. He had moved to stand beside Elian at the bookshelf. His proximity was a warm, solid presence, his scent a familiar comfort that made the hairs on Elian's arms stand on end. Now I think I understand why people tried to save things like this, Elian said, finally turning to look at him. It's not just data. It's proof that someone was here, that they looked up at the sky and saw more than just burning gas. They saw heroes and monsters and stories. He looked at Valerius, his gaze direct. Like Lyran's jasmine flower, it's not just a dried plant. It's proof that he was here, that he loved something beautiful. The direct mention of his brother's name didn't make Valerius flinch this time. Instead, a look of quiet gratitude softened his features. He was a botanist, Valerius said, his voice soft with memory. He cultivated a small hydroponic garden on our family's balcony. He said it was his rebellion, growing something real in a city of synthetics. He reached out, his fingers hovering over the star chart, almost touching Elian's hand. He would have liked you. You have the same quiet defiance. The compliment, so unexpected and so personal, sent a jolt through Elian. He was not just a replacement. He was seen for himself. The empathic link between them flared, and for a dizzying moment Elian felt a surge of Valerius's own emotions, a deep, aching loneliness, a flicker of protective warmth directed at him, and a profound, bone-deep weariness with the system he commanded. It was overwhelming, an intimacy he had never experienced, not even with Reese. It was like seeing into the man's soul. He stumbled back a step, breaking the connection, his heart pounding. Valerius blinked, looking equally disoriented, as if he had felt it too. The proximity, it seems to be accelerating the bonding process, the director stated, his voice regaining its clinical edge as he retreated behind the shield of science. Is that part of the experiment too? Elian asked, his voice sharper than he intended, a defense against the terrifying vulnerability he had just felt. It is an unforeseen complication, Valerius admitted, his gaze guarded. A bond formed under these circumstances, without the proper rights, it would be recognized by neither law, nor biology as legitimate. It would be a liability. A liability. The word was a splash of cold water. No matter how close they became, how deeply their scents intertwined, they were still separated by an insurmountable wall of politics and power. He was an anomaly, and Valerius was the system itself. Any connection between them was a bug in the program, a flaw to be patched. The precarious peace of their seclusion was shattered 2 days later. An urgent summons appeared on Valerius's private comm, the insignia of the Enclave High Council flashing insistently. Valerius's face went rigid. I have to attend, he said, his voice tight. They are demanding a report on the Gamma 7 anomaly. He looked at Elian, and for the first time, Elian saw genuine fear in the director's eyes. It was not fear for himself, but for Elian. They will want you processed, reintegrated. Your existence is a threat to the stability I have spent my life maintaining. What will you tell them? Elian asked, his own fear a cold knot in his stomach. I will tell them the subject has been neutralized, Valerius said, his voice like ice. I will falsify the records. I will buy us time. He walked to the door, then paused, turning back. Do not leave these quarters. Do not access any external comms. You are a ghost now, Elian. Officially, you no longer exist. He used his name, Elian, a final desperate act of defiance against the system that would reduce him to a number. Then he was gone, the door sliding shut with a heavy final thud. Elian was alone again, but the loneliness was different now. It was sharp and laced with terror. He was a secret, a dangerous living secret hidden in the heart of the Enclave, and the man protecting him had just walked into the lion's den. He paced the apartment, a caged animal, the scent of his own anxiety, a sharp, acrid tang in the air. He could feel Valerius's absence like a physical wound. The bond, this unwanted, undeniable thing between them, stretched thin and taut across the distance. He could feel a faint echo of the Alpha's own state, a cold, controlled calm on the surface, but a raging storm of conflict underneath. Hours passed. The silence of the apartment became a screaming void. He tried to read, but the words blurred. He tried to eat, but the food tasted like ash. He was suspended in a state of pure, helpless waiting. And then a chime. Not from the main door, but from a service entrance he hadn't even known existed. He froze. Valerius would have used the main door. The guards would not have come without the director. A cold dread washed over him. He backed away from the door, his heart pounding. The chime sounded again, more insistent this time. A voice came through the speaker, distorted and unfamiliar. Elian, it's me. Open the door, please. Reese. The name was a blow, a ghost from a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. How had he gotten here? How did he know? His first instinct was a surge of pure, unadulterated relief, Reese, safety, sanity. He rushed to the door, his fingers fumbling with the control panel, but as he was about to open it, a flicker of Valerius's cold logic, a piece of the Alpha's own paranoia that had seeped into him, made him pause. Do not leave these quarters. Do not access any external comms. Valerius had made him a ghost for a reason. Reese's presence here was impossible. It was a breach of security so profound it could only have been sanctioned from the highest level. Elian, I was so worried, Reese's voice came again, laced with a desperate sincerity that tore at Elian's heart. They told me you had a biocontagion, that you were in quarantine, but I pulled some strings. I had to see you. Pulled strings? A beta archivist had no strings to pull that led to the director's private, off-the-grid quarters. It was a lie, a well-intentioned lie perhaps, but a lie nonetheless. He was a pawn. The council was using him. They were using the last remnant of Elian's old life to draw him out, to prove that Valerius was hiding him. If he opened that door, he would not only be condemning himself, but he would be signing Valerius's death warrant. He backed away from the door, a terrible, wrenching choice tearing him apart. The life he'd had, the simple, quiet love he had shared with Reese, was on one side of that door. On the other side was, what? A dangerous, impossible future with a man who saw him as an experiment, a ghost, a liability. But that man had also shown him a glimpse of his broken soul. That man was at this very moment risking everything to protect him. His loyalty, he realized with a sickening lurch, was no longer with the past. It had been irrevocably given to the Alpha who had claimed him, body and soul. I'm sorry, Reese, he whispered to the silent door, the words a eulogy for the man he used to be. I can't. He sank to the floor, his body trembling, and listened as the chimes eventually faded, replaced once again by the profound, terrifying silence of his gilded cage. He had made his choice. He had chosen the monster in the maze, and now he could only pray that the monster was strong enough to protect them both. The silence that followed Reese's departure was heavier than before, weighted with the finality of a door closed forever. Elian was adrift, the last tie to his old life severed. He was Valerius's secret now, wholly and completely. The empathic bond, which had been a faint hum, now felt like his only connection to another living soul. He paced the length of the apartment, from the window overlooking the dome to the library filled with the ghosts of dead poets, feeling Valerius's distant turmoil as a cold knot in his own gut. He could feel the Alpha's frustration, the icy rage he was holding in check, the immense pressure of the Council's scrutiny. It was like listening to a storm from miles away, feeling the drop in pressure long before the first clap of thunder. When Valerius finally returned, it was late. The artificial lights of the Enclave had dimmed to their nocturnal cycle, casting the city in a cool blue glow. The door slid open and the director stepped inside, his movements stiff, his uniform looking unusually severe. He didn't look at Elian at first. He walked to the great window and stood with his back to the room, staring out at the rain-streaked dome. His scent filled the room, and it was wrong. The usual calm notes of sandalwood and ozone were still there, but they were laced with something sharp and bitter, the scent of stress and barely suppressed violence. "They know," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "They don't have proof, but they know I'm lying. Your former partner's visit was a test, a probe, one I had not anticipated." "I didn't open the door," Elian said quietly from across the room. "I didn't speak to him." Valerius turned, and the look on his face was a mixture of profound relief and something darker, something that looked like pained admiration. "You chose," he stated. "It wasn't a question. You chose this cage over the memory of your freedom." "It stopped being a choice a long time ago," Elian replied, the truth of the words settling into his bones. "My freedom ended the moment my biology changed. You just gave my cage a better view." The honesty, raw and unvarnished, seemed to break through the director's composure. He walked towards Elian, his steps slow and deliberate, until he was standing directly in front of him. He was so close, Elian had to tilt his head back to meet his gaze. The height difference, the sheer physical presence of the Alpha was overwhelming. "This is no longer a scientific observation, Elian," Valerius said, his voice low and intense. He used his name, and it was an anchor in the storm. "This has become an act of treason. By concealing you, I have defied the Council and the founding principles of the Enclave. They will not stop until they find you, and when they do, they will have you vivisected for research and me executed for sedition." The stark reality of their situation hung between them, cold and sharp as a shard of glass. This was the endgame. "Why?" Elian whispered, the question encompassing everything. "Why risk it all? For an anomaly? For a ghost?" Valerius reached out, not with the clinical detachment of before, but with a new, hesitant urgency. His hand came to rest on Elian's cheek, his thumb gently stroking the soft skin just below his eye. The touch was electric, a jolt of warmth and connection that made Elian's breath catch in his throat. "Because you are not an anomaly," Valerius murmured, his gray eyes searching Elian's face as if trying to memorize it. "You are inevitable. You are the proof that this entire system is built on a lie. We preach control, order, the suppression of instinct. We have tried to sterilize the human genome, to prune away the messy, chaotic parts. And yet here you are, life, uncontrollable, unpredictable, beautiful life. You are a rebellion in its purest form, simply by existing. His gaze dropped to Elian's lips. "I spent my life upholding the integrity of the machine, only to find that its most perfect component was the one it was designed to eliminate." The space between them vanished. Valerius leaned in and captured Elian's lips in a kiss that was not gentle or tender. It was a kiss of desperation, of hunger, of two collapsing stars finding each other in the void. It was raw and honest and shattering. All the control Valerius held so tightly, all the fear Elian had been drowning in, poured into that single point of contact. Elian's hands came up to grip the front of the director's uniform, holding on as if he were the only solid thing in the universe. The kiss was a confession, a surrender, a declaration of war against the world outside their door. When they finally broke apart, gasping for air, they were both trembling. The bond between them, which had been a quiet hum, now roared to life, a searing, undeniable connection that fused them together on a level that was deeper than skin, deeper than bone. It was a bonding of souls. "They will tear this city apart to find you," Valerius said, his forehead resting against Elian's, his voice rough with emotion. "Then we can't stay in the city," Elian replied, a desperate, impossible idea taking root in his mind. "The archives. I spent my life studying the past, the old world. There are schematics, old exit tunnels, routes to the surface that were sealed centuries ago. They're probably collapsed, irradiated, impassable. But they exist." Valerius pulled back, his eyes wide with a dawning, incredulous hope. He, the master of the present, the architect of the future, had never thought to look to the past for a way out. "The surface is uninhabitable," he stated, the old ingrained doctrine fighting against the new desperate possibility. "Is it?" Elian challenged. "Or is that just another part of the system? Another lie to keep everyone inside the cage? We are living proof that the system's data can be wrong." The archivist, the quiet, overlooked cog, was now offering the blueprint for their escape. He was not just a rebellion by existing, he was now its strategist. The irony was not lost on either of them. A slow, dangerous smile spread across Valerius's face. It was the smile of a man who had just been reminded how to fight. "A flaw in the data," he murmured, a strange light in his eyes. "Get me those schematics." The experiment was over. The rebellion had begun. The plan was madness, a desperate gamble built on the decaying data of a dead world. For the next 2 days, the director's quarters transformed from a cage into a war room. Elian, using Valerius's high-level access codes, dove deep into the Enclave's central archives, bypassing the public-facing, sanitized histories and accessing the raw, unfiltered data streams from the founding era. He was in his element, the familiar rush of information a comforting balm to his frayed nerves. He cross-referenced geological surveys with maintenance logs for the city's foundation, searching for forgotten pathways, for structural weaknesses, for a single overlooked crack in the perfect edifice of the Enclave. Valerius, meanwhile, moved with a cold, terrifying efficiency. He was a master of the system he now intended to break. He sliced their digital footprints, creating ghost protocols and looping data trails that would mask their activity. He requisitioned equipment, rebreathers, radiation suits, long-range comm jammers, energy packs, under the guise of a classified, deep-level security audit. He moved like a phantom through his own domain, his every action a quiet, deliberate act of treason. They worked in a state of heightened, focused synergy, the bond between them a silent, efficient form of communication. A flicker of anxiety from Elian as he hit a data wall would bring Valerius to his side, his sharp, logical mind finding a new angle of attack. A surge of frustration from Valerius as a requisition was flagged would be soothed by a quiet touch from Elian, a calming wave of pheromones that seemed to sharpen the Alpha's focus. They were two halves of a single organism, working towards a singular, impossible goal: escape. They found it on the third day, a subterranean aqueduct sealed and marked as structurally unsound after a seismic event 2 centuries prior. It was designed to drain runoff from the lowest levels of the enclave into a deep, natural cavern system. According to the schematics, one of those caverns had an outflow that led theoretically to the surface, miles away from the enclave's monitored perimeter. It was a one-way trip. Once they entered the aqueduct, the heavy, magnetically sealed blast door could not be opened from the inside. There would be no going back. "It's a tomb," Valerius said, his voice grim as he looked at the holographic schematic floating between them. "Or a womb," Elian countered, his eyes shining with a feverish light, a passage from one life to the next. The night of their escape, a storm, real or manufactured, raged against the dome, the sound of the synthetic rain a fittingly dramatic soundtrack for their departure. They dressed in dark, functional gear, the sleek black fabric a stark contrast to the uniforms and medical gowns they had worn before. Valerius carried a pack with their supplies and a single heavy-duty plasma cutter. Elian carried a data slate with the schematics and a small leather-bound book of poetry, the one that had belonged to Lyran. He couldn't bear to leave the ghost behind. They moved through the service corridors of the director's tower, a place Valerius knew better than the men who had built it. The air was thick with the scent of ozone from the power conduits and the metallic tang of recycled air. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every distant sound was a potential alarm. Elian's heart hammered against his ribs, but the steady, warm pressure of Valerius's hand on the small of his back was a grounding force. The Alpha was a study in controlled calm, his senses alert, his movements fluid and silent. He was a predator in his natural habitat, even as he was betraying it. They reached the blast door to the aqueduct, deep in the underbelly of the enclave, a place of groaning pipes and perpetual damp. The air was cold, smelling of rust and stagnant water. The door was immense, a slab of pitted, corroded metal bearing the ancient insignia of the enclave's first engineers. A red light on the control panel next to it blinked with a steady, ominous pulse. "Warning, structural integrity compromised. Atmosphere beyond this point unviable." "This is the last chance to reconsider," Valerius said, his voice low. He turned to Elian, his gray eyes searching his face in the dim emergency lighting. "Beyond this door, there is no system, no medicine, no guarantee of survival. Only the unknown. You once told me I was a disruption to your system, D." Elian replied, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. He reached up and touched Valerius's cheek, the same way the Alpha had touched him. "I think a little disruption will do us both some good." A faint smile touched Valerius's lips. He turned to the control panel and entered a long, complex override code. With a groan of protesting metal and a hiss of depressurizing atmosphere, the massive door began to slide open, revealing a gaping maw of absolute darkness. A gust of wind, cold and smelling of wet stone and decay, washed over them. It was the first natural air Elian had ever felt. It was terrifying. It was wonderful. They stepped through the doorway, into the black. The door slid shut behind them with a deafening, final boom, sealing them in. They were cut off. They were alone. Valerius activated a light on his pack, its powerful beam cutting a swath through the oppressive darkness. They were in a massive circular tunnel, its walls slick with moisture and covered in strange, pale fungi. The air was cold and heavy but breathable, though the rebreathers would be necessary later. The only sound was the slow, steady drip of water somewhere in the distance. "No alarms," Valerius said, his voice hushed, reverent. "They truly have forgotten this place." They began to walk, their footsteps echoing in the vast, silent space. It was a descent into the forgotten bowels of the earth. The hours blurred. They navigated collapsed sections, crawled through narrow maintenance shafts, their progress slow and arduous. The bond between them was a lifeline in the dark. They didn't need to speak. A squeeze of the hand, a slight push, a shared feeling of caution or urgency was all the communication they needed. In the darkness, stripped of his title and his power, Valerius was no longer the director. He was just an alpha protecting his mate, his small pack of two, on a desperate journey through hostile territory. And Elian, the archivist, the anomaly, felt a sense of purpose he had never known. He was no longer a curator of a dead past, but a navigator towards a living future. They were forced to rest in a small, dry alcove, the energy packs for their light needing to be conserved. They sat in the near-total darkness, the only light coming from the faint bioluminescence of the fungi on the walls, which cast a ghostly blue-green glow. They shared a nutrient bar, the bland paste, a welcome fuel. "Were you ever afraid?" Elian asked into the darkness, his voice a soft murmur. "Before me, I mean, in your perfect, controlled life." Valerius was silent for a long time. Elian could hear the soft sound of his breathing, feel the warmth of his body next to his. "I was terrified every moment of every day," the Alpha confessed, his voice raw with a vulnerability he only ever showed in the dark. "Terrified of making a mistake, terrified of a variable I couldn't control, terrified of failing the way I failed Lyran. The control wasn't power, Elian, it was a shield. The most elaborate, most heavily fortified shield in the world. And you walked right through it." He found Elian's hand in the dark, his fingers lacing with his. "I am still afraid, but it's different now. Before I was afraid of losing control. Now, I'm just afraid of losing you." The simple, devastating honesty of it broke something open in Elian's chest. He leaned his head on the Alpha's shoulder, a gesture of pure, uncomplicated trust. He was no longer a project, a subject, a second chance. He was the reason. "You won't," he whispered, a promise made to the darkness, to the ghost of Lyran, to the man beside him. "We will see the sky together." They sat in silence for a long time after that, two fugitives in the heart of the earth holding on to a fragile, impossible hope. The journey was far from over, but for the first time in the cold and the dark, surrounded by the ghosts of the past, Elian felt truly, profoundly free. And he was not alone.